Hey guys, tonight we drift into a quieter time, though not necessarily a sleepier one. Imagine the year is 1883. You're in a gaslit room, swaddled in heavy quilts, wearing a high-collared linen nightshirt that buttons up to your chin. The fire is low, the clock ticks, but you're not asleep. In fact, you haven't slept for 3 nights. Welcome to Victorian England, where insomnia is not just a problem, it's a full-blown identity crisis wrapped in chamomile steam. You probably won't survive this without a warm glass of milk and the patience of a governess. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Maybe we're both up too late. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie in a stiff brass bed that creaks if you so much as breathe sideways. Outside, a coal cart rattles by. The mattress is stuffed with horsehair, and the pillow is firm enough to double as a sermon. You're wide awake and no one has invented podcasts yet, or central heating, or anything remotely useful for calming a restless mind. Insomnia isn't just a modern curse. In the Victorian era, it was a frequently discussed nuisance, a medical puzzle, and, depending on whom you asked, a sign of moral failing, poor digestion, or too much poetry. Doctors wrote about it. Poets sighed about it. Housewives complained about it between boiling milk and winding the grandfather clock. There were pamphlets titled How to Fall Asleep Without Vice, and entire columns devoted to the art of proper bedtime pacing. People were tired of being tired, but no one could quite agree on what to do about it. You shift under your scratchy wool blanket and listen to the wall tick. You're not alone. The Victorians were famously terrible sleepers, and yet curiously obsessed with trying to appear well-rested. Sleep was tied up in class, virtue, and how much beef you had at supper. The wealthier you were, the more sleep you were expected to get, but also, paradoxically, the more likely you were to suffer from nervous exhaustion, a diagnosis which conveniently included the inability to sleep without talking about it. The term insomnia itself had only recently entered everyday usage, borrowed from medical Latin in the early 19th century. Before that, people simply spoke of watching or restlessness. A lady might be troubled by night thoughts or given to late contemplations, which sounds poetic until you realize it means lying awake and replaying the day's small humiliations while a candle gutters in the corner. Historians still argue whether insomnia was truly more common in the Victorian era or simply more diagnosed, more pathologized, and more written about in very ornate cursive. But back to you. You're lying there in your monogrammed bed, the curtains pulled tightly against the night. The room is dark, but your brain is not. You've already counted sheep. You've recited verses. You've said the Lord's Prayer backwards, twice. Still nothing. So you do what any respectable 19th century person would do. You ring for the maid and ask for a warm beverage. She brings you a glass of milk, heated gently over a coal stove, served with a spoonful of nutmeg and just enough brandy to soothe the nerves. Because this is the Victorian solution to everything. Add alcohol or blame your spleen. You sip slowly. It's thick and slightly sweet, and for a moment you think it might work. But sleep doesn't come on command. The candle burns low. You try rearranging your pillow. You try holding your breath. You try not thinking about how you haven't slept in 3 nights. That usually works, right? There's no Netflix to binge, no yoga app, just the slow, expanding silence of a world that has already gone to bed without you. And yet, it's strangely comforting, knowing that generations before you also lay awake like this, fidgeting, thinking, waiting, their bodies still, their minds spinning. The difference is they had far fewer distractions and far more milk. You stare at the ceiling and imagine what the next remedy will be. Will it be magnets, laudanum, prayer, a brisk walk at midnight with your doctor's disapproval trailing behind? Don't worry, we'll try them all. The milk is still warm in your stomach, spreading like a polite, creamy hope, and for a moment you lie very still, because everyone knows movement might frighten sleep away. You keep your eyes closed even though you are extremely awake behind them, because Victorians believed eyelids themselves had moral authority. Shut them long enough and surely the body would follow. Warm milk, you've been told, is practically a virtue in liquid form. By the mid-19th century, doctors, etiquette manuals, and mothers with opinions all agreed on one thing: milk before bed was respectable. Tea was suspect. Coffee was practically sinful. Alcohol was complicated. But milk was pure, nourishing, and blessedly boring. It fit the Victorian ideal perfectly: calm, domestic, and faintly moralizing. You imagine the scene repeated in thousands of households just like yours. A servant padding down the hall, a saucepan quietly lifted from the stove, milk warmed carefully, never boiled because boiling was thought to excite it, nutmeg added for the nerves, sometimes honey, occasionally a splash of brandy, though no one ever admitted that part out loud. The belief was simple: warm milk soothed the stomach, and a soothed stomach soothed the mind. The Victorians were obsessed with digestion. Nearly every ailment, from headaches to heartbreak, was blamed on improper digestion. If you couldn't sleep, it was probably because dinner had offended your insides. Historians still argue whether this obsession came from genuine medical observation or from cultural anxiety about indulgence and control. Either way, the stomach bore the blame for everything. So you lie there, hands folded politely over your chest, hoping the milk is making its slow, righteous journey through your system. You try to think of bland things: accounting ledgers, plain curtains, sheep that are very well behaved. And while you wait, your mind drifts to the rules that came with this nightly ritual. Milk had to be drunk slowly. Quickly was vulgar. You weren't meant to read afterward. That strained the eyes. You definitely weren't meant to think. Thinking after milk defeated the purpose entirely. A proper Victorian bedtime involved calm thoughts, calm digestion, and calm morals, preferably all at once. Of course, calm is difficult when you're lying awake listening to the clock rehearse its monologue. Some families swore by milk straight from the cow, still warm, consumed just before retiring. Others preferred it diluted with water, because richness was considered overstimulating. There were debates, actual debates, about skim milk versus whole milk for the nerves. Whole milk was comforting but heavy. Skim milk was virtuous but disappointing, much like many Victorian marriages really. A quirky fringe belief circulated in medical pamphlets. Milk absorbed the temperament of the animal it came from. Cow milk was calming. Goat milk was allegedly restless. Mare's milk? Absolutely not before bed. If this sounds unscientific, congratulations. You're thinking like a modern person. But at the time it made perfect sense. You adjust your blanket, careful not to let cold air reach your ankles. Cold ankles were another known enemy of sleep. Somewhere a doctor is nodding vigorously, and yet you're still awake. The milk hasn't betrayed you exactly, it's just not performing miracles. You feel comfortable, yes, cozy even, but your thoughts are still wandering, looping through the day's conversations, replaying that one awkward pause at dinner, wondering if the maid noticed you rang the bell twice. Milk, it turns out, cannot silence a brain trained to worry politely. Victorian advice columns suggested patience. Allow the milk time to work, they said, as if it were negotiating with your consciousness. Some even recommended lying on your right side afterward to assist the natural flow of digestion. You try that, then the left side, then your back. You briefly consider standing on your head but reject the idea as unladylike. Still, the ritual itself is soothing. The predictability, the quiet, the sense that you're doing the correct thing even if it isn't working yet. There's comfort in that, following the rules of a world that promises rest if you behave properly enough. And maybe that's the real purpose of the milk. Not to knock you out, but to reassure you that sleeplessness is being addressed, managed, civilized, that you're not failing at sleep, you're simply in process. Your eyes finally flutter, not with sleep, but with resignation. The milk glass sits empty on the bedside table, faintly smelling of nutmeg and hope. You sigh. If milk won't do it alone, you suppose you'll need something stronger, perhaps magnets. You lie on your side now, the milk having done its valiant best, but your eyes are still wide in the dark. The room is hushed, except for the soft shifting of the house, the groan of old wood, the murmur of pipes, the faint ticking of a clock that sounds louder by the minute. And your stomach. Well, it feels agreeable, full, but not drowsy, respectably settled. Which brings you to digestion. The Victorians, as it turns out, were almost neurotically concerned with digestion, particularly how it related to sleep. Entire treatises were written on how the state of your stomach at bedtime could determine whether you fell into peaceful slumber or spent the night communing with the ceiling. Dinner in a respectable household was served no later than 7, sometimes 6. The later you ate, the more suspicion you attracted. Eating past sundown was considered risky at best, rebellious at worst. The body, they claimed, needed time, preferably 3 to 4 hours, to complete its digestive duties before it could even think about sleeping. A heavy supper was a sin, one that often came back to punish you around 2:30 a.m., when you were forced to contemplate whether that second helping of pigeon pie had invited insomnia straight through the front door. So you think back to your own dinner. A modest roast, steamed carrots, maybe a potato or two, light, civilized, nothing that should haunt you at this hour. But still, here you are, conducting a full internal inquisition on your last meal, wondering if the sauce was a little too rich or if the roll should have been smaller. Victorian advice manuals warned against strong flavors after 5 p.m. No spiced meats, they cautioned. No pickled vegetables, and absolutely no onions. Onions, apparently, were the gateway to gastric distress and a night of moral compromise. Historians still debate whether these warnings were based on genuine gastrointestinal sensitivity or simply reflected deeper cultural anxieties about indulgence. Food was tied to self-control. And sleep? Sleep was the reward for behaving properly, digestively, emotionally, spiritually. In other words, if you couldn't sleep, it was probably your fault. You roll onto your back, trying not to disturb the covers. Digestion, you've been told, is best supported by stillness. Too much tossing and your organs become confused, or worse, irritable. And here's where things get slightly absurd. Some sleep manuals recommended that you chew your dinner a minimum of 30 times per bite, not for calorie counting, but because proper mastication was thought to pre-digest the food and thereby prevent nighttime gastric misbehavior. You imagine chewing a single bite of boiled beef 30 times, and suddenly you feel quite grateful to be living in the modern era, insomnia and all. Others swore by a post-dinner walk, nothing vigorous, just a gentle stroll around the drawing room. Outdoors was discouraged. Night air was too unpredictable, too damp, and prone to excite the lungs. More eccentric Victorians took this further. A fringe group of health reformers believed you should lie on a slanted board after dinner, tilted slightly with your head downward, to assist gravity in pulling the food past the bile duct with minimal offense. They sold such boards via catalog, often with enthusiastic testimonials like, "I now sleep like the righteous, with my gullet happily aligned." You do not own such a board, which is perhaps part of the problem. Still, you wonder, if your digestion is so peaceful, why won't your thoughts settle? That's the trouble with insomnia. It rarely shows up alone. You may blame your dinner, or the weather, or even the quality of the mattress, but the truth is your mind is still busy, turning over the day's anxieties like a cat needing a blanket that will never quite feel right. In the Victorian worldview, mental overstimulation was just as dangerous as indigestion. Evening hours were meant for calming pursuits, knitting, quiet conversation, slow piano pieces. Reading was permitted, but only fiction of a certain dullness. No sensational novels, definitely no politics. Emotional excitement, like onions, was simply asking for trouble. You consider this as you stare at the ceiling. Perhaps you've broken a rule. Maybe you thought too hard during dinner, or maybe it's just you. That quiet, creeping suspicion was common then. Sleeplessness often felt like a personal failing, a sign you were too something, too anxious, too vain, too indulgent, too intellectual. Even women, especially women, were warned not to read too much, lest their minds become overheated and unable to rest. So instead, you were meant to practice patience. Lie still. Breathe evenly. Imagine a calm lake, or a sleeping lamb, or the moral satisfaction of a well-digested meal. And wait, because maybe, just maybe, the body will listen. Maybe it will forgive you. Maybe it will stop thinking about biscuits and bile ducts and let you drift. Or maybe you'll need something more persuasive. A pillow with magnets, perhaps? Still no sleep. Your digestion has cooperated. The milk is long gone. You've lain on both sides and recited gentle affirmations to your liver. And yet your eyelids remain stubbornly open, like small velvet curtains refusing to close on a show that should have ended hours ago. It's time to try something more creative. You rise quietly. Your slippers hush against the floorboards. You shuffle across the room and open a small cabinet. Inside, a tidy array of Victorian sleep tools, each one stranger than the last. You select a few, carry them back to bed, and brace yourself for the kind of sleep science that involves no science whatsoever. Let's begin with a foot bath. That's right. A warm foot soak, precisely 15 minutes long. No more, no less. Victorian manuals insisted that drawing blood toward the feet would relieve congestion in the brain. You imagine the blood inside you politely following instructions, drifting downward with an apologetic bow. Your basin is filled, your feet slide in, bliss, sort of. Now for the sound element. A small handbell sits nearby. You give it a cautious shake, and its chime rings soft and high, like a nervous fairy. Sound therapy was popular among the more eccentric households. The belief was that certain tones, especially those resonant with the natural vibrations of the body, could harmonize your restless spirit and nudge it toward sleep. You picture a Victorian gentleman in a paisley robe standing in his parlor, solemnly ringing a bell at his own head and nodding with satisfaction as his insomnia retreats in polite horror. Historians still argue whether these methods had any genuine effect or were simply elaborate bedtime theater, placebo dressed in satin. You remove your feet from the water, pat them dry, and move to the next item in your toolkit, the fainting couch. Technically not for fainting, despite the name. This gently sloped chaise lounge with a rolled-back rest was commonly used for nervous repose. If your bed wasn't doing the trick, perhaps a change in angle would confuse your body into slumber. You lie back, draped in a shawl. Your posture, half draped, half bored. You stare at the ceiling and wait for something magical to happen. This is when you remember the breathing technique. Victorian sleep guide is often suggested counting your breaths backward from 100, not simply as a distraction, but because the declining numbers mirrored the decline of consciousness. By the time you reached 1, you were supposed to be asleep, or at least too confused to care. You try. 100, 99, 98, 97, still very awake. The fainting couch creaks as you shift. You wonder if it's the shawl that's wrong. Too thick? Too thin? There are no answers, only options. A friend once swore by bedtime calisthenics. Gentle stretching of the limbs while lying flat. A kind of horizontal ballet for the sleepless elite. You try pointing your toes, then flexing them. A mild cramp in your calf protests. You abandon the experiment because clearly your body is not an aesthete. And yet beneath all this silliness, something has shifted. You're distracted now. Not from sleep, but from trying to sleep. And in that space, where effort loosens and expectation falls silent, there's the faintest hint of drowsiness at the edges of your mind. The Victorians weren't always wrong. Sometimes ritual, even absurd ritual, gives your body permission to rest. Of course, that's assuming you're not startled awake again by your own pillow, because tonight, you've opted for the magnetic one. The pillow looks innocent enough. It's plump, slightly overstuffed, wrapped in crisp linen, and carries a faint scent of lavender sachets. But hidden inside, stitched discreetly into the seams, are small, evenly spaced magnetic plates. Not strong magnets, just enough to realign your natural energies, as the pamphlet promised. You lower your head onto it slowly, as if you might accidentally magnetize your thoughts and never get them back. Victorian magnetic therapy was a strange blend of wishful thinking and theatrical science, based loosely, very loosely, on Mesmer's theories of animal magnetism. This new wave of sleep products claimed to soothe the body by influencing its invisible currents. If your sleeplessness was caused by disrupted vibrational harmony, then perhaps aligning your head with a bed of polished magnets would restore your nocturnal grace. You try not to smirk as you lie back. It's hard to take your own pillow seriously when it claims to have healing powers. But it's also oddly comforting. You feel grounded, weighted, but not unpleasantly so. Your thoughts slow, not from belief but from the novelty of the situation. It's hard to spiral into anxiety when your head feels like it's being gently persuaded into stillness by 19th century pseudoscience. Magnetic headbands were also sold if the pillow failed. One popular version was studded with small copper discs and bore the dubious endorsement of a duke who apparently hadn't blinked since Tuesday. Historians still argue whether these devices were harmless indulgences or early precursors to more legitimate biofeedback techniques. The marketing language was often ambitious. Some ads claimed their magnetic bed frames could correct melancholia, cure hysteria, and even reverse hair loss. Sleep, of course, was just one of the many miracles expected. You close your eyes and imagine the workshops where these products were made, men in waistcoats wiring together coils, carefully wrapping them in velvet, whispering sales pitches into the ether, guaranteed to neutralize all moral exhaustion. Victorian society had a complicated relationship with rest. On one hand, sleep was seen as virtuous, an orderly, obedient body returning to nature's embrace. On the other hand, too much rest invited suspicion, laziness, indolence, a failure to properly engage with one's civic or moral duty. So magnetic cures fit perfectly into the ethos. They allowed you to rest, yes, but only if you were also doing something about your rest. No one wanted to appear passive. Even sleep had to be earned, engineered, activated. You shift slightly on the pillow. The magnets hold steady. Nothing miraculous has happened yet, but you do feel a little heavier in the head. Maybe it's the suggestion, maybe it's the milk, maybe you're just tired of trying. The next item on your list is far stranger: the magnetic bed canopy. A net of fine wires suspended from the ceiling designed to bathe the sleeper in harmonious current. Expensive, elaborate, and almost entirely ineffective, but undeniably impressive. Some even buzzed softly when the wind changed. Perfect for insomniacs who also enjoyed a light electrical hum at bedtime. You don't have a canopy, just the pillow. But that's probably for the best. You think again of Franz Mesmer, the 18th century physician who started it all with his theories of invisible fluids and universal harmony. He believed that the human body could be influenced by magnetism, that energy blockages caused illness, and that a skilled practitioner could manipulate these forces through passes of the hands. It all sounds mystical and dubious now, but at the time it felt scientific, structured, almost spiritual. And in a society where sleeplessness was both common and embarrassing, Mesmer's ideas offered hope wrapped in drama. Victorians weren't naive. They knew some of these products were gimmicks, but they also knew the mind was a powerful thing. If believing in a magnetic pillow helped you sleep, then maybe the pillow wasn't the cure. Maybe it was the permission. And that's where you are now. Somewhere between science and self-soothing, your breath has slowed. Your arms rest easily at your sides. The house around you is quieter now, only the faintest creak as it settles into its own dreams. You're not asleep yet, but you're very close. You feel it in the way your body stops arguing with the mattress, in the way your thoughts lose their edges, in the way the magnets, real or imagined, hold you in place like gentle hands. You're almost there. Of course, it would help if the bed itself didn't suddenly shift. The bed doesn't jump exactly. It's more of a gentle lurch, like a ship shifting at anchor, or a polite reminder that even furniture, after a while, gets restless. You sit up slowly, your magnetized pillow quietly judging your movements. Nothing seems broken, nothing's out of place, and yet the sensation remains. Your bed feels active, as if it's somehow become a participant in your quest for sleep, which, strangely enough, was exactly what many Victorians hoped for. This is the age of the patented sleep apparatus. Your bed isn't just a bed anymore. It's a tool, a treatment, a physical declaration that you are doing something about your insomnia. You lie back and consider the trends. Weighted blankets, already popular. Called pressing quilts at the time, they were believed to calm the nervous system by gently suppressing motion. The more anxious the sleeper, the heavier the quilt. One 1872 medical journal enthusiastically recommended a woolen cover not less than 15 pounds for restless boys and melancholic spinsters. Sound familiar? Then there were incline beds, frames subtly tilted to elevate the head and encourage better cranial circulation. Some claimed these would reduce night terrors. Others said they improved digestion. Still others said nothing at all because they were finally asleep for once. You shift your legs, noticing the bed's firmness, the way it gently resists movement. That's not accidental. Victorian mattress technology was advancing rapidly. Horsehair stuffing, springs, adjustable lumbar support, achieved through terrifying arrays of straps and buttons. It was all part of the race to engineer sleep. Rest became a mechanical problem, and mechanical problems, in the age of industry, were made to be solved. One particularly ambitious inventor designed a sleep harmonizer that combined pressure, vibration, and faint electrical currents. The user would lie on a board that buzzed faintly beneath them, coaxing the body toward alignment with the Earth's natural frequencies. Historians still argue whether these devices were harmless eccentricities or early indicators of modern sleep science. Some mock them. Others point out how close we are today to the same ideas, just with sleeker branding and Bluetooth compatibility. You roll your shoulders against the mattress, trying to appreciate its resistance. It's firm, supportive, slightly judgmental, and yet there's comfort in it, in the sense that something around you is actively trying. That was the whole appeal, really. The bed, the pillow, the devices, they gave the illusion of control. You weren't just lying awake, you were engaged in a process, a nightly ritual of realignment and repositioning, where each physical adjustment represented hope. It's not so different from how we chase sleep today. Temperature-regulating pillows, app-controlled lights, mattresses that track your REM cycles and send passive-aggressive reports to your inbox. The tools evolve, but the feeling doesn't change. You're chasing rest like it's something external, something to be earned or engineered. You close your eyes and imagine being inside a Victorian bedroom showroom. Everything polished, precise. Posters promising guaranteed slumber in 30 nights or less. Testimonials from well-rested clergymen. Rows of patented devices lined up like soldiers in the war against wakefulness. A woman in a bustle adjusts a knob on a sleep chair. A gentleman in striped pajamas reclines on a somnolent cradle that gently rocks while playing hymns in a minor key. Everyone is trying, and that's oddly comforting, because no matter how strange the tools, the intention was always the same: to rest, to release, to slip beyond the reach of clocks. You lie still now, allowing the weight of the mattress to hold you. Your breath slows again, your arms soften. The night wraps around you like a slightly too formal shawl. You're closer than before, but something's still keeping you awake. It's not your digestion, not your bed, not even the magnets. It's something more complicated, and possibly Victorian. The room hasn't changed. The bed is firm, the pillow vaguely magnetic. The air still carries that faint scent of lavender and warm dust. but something inside you resists the drift into sleep. A lingering hum, a tension just beneath the skin. Not fear, exactly, just vigilance. And now, finally, you suspect what might be behind it. You are unfortunately a Victorian woman. Not literally, but in this particular version of history, your restlessness matches the profile precisely. Because in the 19th century, sleeplessness wasn't just a medical issue, it was a gendered one, and women bore the brunt of it. You shift beneath the quilt, suddenly more aware of your own body, how it breathes, how it waits, how it struggles to behave. Because that's what Victorian women were supposed to do. Be quiet, be composed, be perpetually poised for sleep, even when their minds were wide awake. Doctors of the era were very interested in female insomnia, not as a symptom but as a flaw. Nervous conditions, wandering wombs, uterine insomnia, you name it, they diagnosed it. If a woman couldn't sleep, it was probably because her reproductive system was too emotional, or her brain was too busy, or, God forbid, she had been reading novels after dark. Historians still argue whether the era's medical obsession with sleepless women reflected genuine concern or deeply rooted misogyny dressed in a white coat. You lie still thinking about the way women were treated for insomnia. They were advised to rest, but not too much. Exercise, but not strenuously. Think, but not deeply. Be cheerful, but never overly excitable. All things in moderation, especially your thoughts. And if that didn't work, well, there were always tonics and tinctures, and eventually the doctor would come with his little black bag and his quiet suspicions that perhaps you were simply not trying hard enough. The blame almost always fell inward. Women were told their sleeplessness came from unnatural curiosity, excessive emotion, or a failure to submit to marital routine. In other words, stop thinking so much, stop feeling so much, and for heaven's sake, stop wanting anything after 9 p.m. You sigh into the dark. In truth, many Victorian women were utterly exhausted, raising children, running households, managing appearances, suppressing opinions. It was all done with an iron corset of decorum. And then, at the end of the day, they were expected to lie perfectly still and let go of it all, silently and without complaint. But the mind has its own agenda. No wonder they couldn't sleep. So what did they do? They wrote, quietly, privately, in diaries, in letters, in the margins of recipe books. They recorded their wakefulness not as complaint, but as quiet rebellion. Could not sleep, one woman scrawled in looping ink. Felt heartsick but smiled as expected. Took warm milk, still heartsick. Another wrote, he says I mustn't think after sundown. I think constantly, just more quietly. These late-night reflections often survive only as scraps, but they hum with something familiar. Not just restlessness, but a kind of alertness. A resistance to surrendering fully, as if sleep itself were a small act of betrayal of their thoughts, their time, their truth. You lie on your back and wonder, if you had lived then, would your doctor have given you a sedative or a sermon? It likely depended on your class, your clothes, and how convincingly you smiled when asked. Some women were prescribed silence. Others were given bromide powders and told to rest more vigorously. A few, those with influence or money, might be sent to seaside retreats, where the sea air was expected to wash away sleeplessness along with improper opinions. You remember the foot bath, the magnetic pillow, the elaborate attempts to coax your body toward rest. But for many Victorian women, Sleep wasn't something to be coaxed, it was something to be granted. By husbands, by doctors, by a culture that measured rest in obedience. Still, some women found their own way. They created routines. They found comfort in rituals, brushing their hair 100 times, folding linen, whispering lullabies to themselves long after the children had gone quiet. They built small islands of stillness in nights that refused to soften. You think of them now, scattered across gaslit cities, lying in rooms just like yours, hands folded over cotton nightgowns, thoughts quietly unspooling in the dark. Still awake, just like you. Your thoughts drift uneasily now, slow but tangled. The heaviness in your limbs suggests sleep is near, but something still sparks at the edges of consciousness, a low flicker, just bright enough to keep you tethered to wakefulness. You've tried warmth, patience, digestion, even magnets. But the Victorians had one more trick. You reach for the bottle, laudanum. Well, not you, not really, but a woman just like you might have once. Laudanum was the era's not-so-secret weapon against nearly everything. Sleeplessness, coughs, melancholy, menstrual cramps, toothaches, overthinking, undersleeping, grief, boredom. It was, in essence, 10% opium and 90% respectable packaging. You didn't need a prescription. You just needed a pharmacy, a few coins, and a willingness to overlook the part where your bedtime remedy was chemically identical to what would, in later centuries, be classified as a controlled substance. You lie still and imagine it. A tiny glass bottle, amber in the firelight with a paper label reading McAllister's soothing drops for night disturbances. The directions are vague, the tone comforting. It implies that all good women use it and the best ones don't talk about it. Laudanum was everywhere. It sat on the nightstands of middle-class mothers, aging poets, anxious clergymen. It was slipped into babies' bottles and stirred into husbands' tea. It was a cure, a crutch, and a quiet kind of rebellion. Historians still argue whether its popularity was driven more by medical ignorance or social necessity. Maybe both, because in a world where emotional suffering was often dismissed or moralized, laudanum offered relief that didn't require explanation. You couldn't sleep? Take a few drops. You still couldn't sleep? Take a few more. Eventually you wouldn't care. You exhale slowly. You haven't taken any, of course, but the thought of it, the idea of a cure so simple, so immediate, is almost seductive, a kind of borrowed permission to finally stop thinking. Doctors praised laudanum for its gentle quieting of the nerves, especially in women. One popular guide described it as a lullaby in liquid form, ideal for feminine constitutions, which is code for, "You're probably just overwrought. Take this and stop being inconvenient." There was a dark side, of course. Addiction, tolerance, withdrawal that no one understood. Women who started with a few drops a night and ended up unable to function without it. Families whispered about nervous disorders, never naming the brown bottles hidden in every drawer. Still, the line between medicine and vice was blurrier then. Everyone was tired. Everyone wanted to feel better. And no one had podcasts or blackout curtains or a decent understanding of neurochemistry. So they turned to what worked. You nestled deeper into the bed, imagining the weight of that era pressing gently against your chest. Not oppressive exactly, just persistent. A cultural expectation that sleep was a virtue, and waking after midnight was a silent confession of guilt. You remember the women from the night before, the ones who wrote in the margins, who stayed awake on purpose, who folded laundry slowly in gaslight and took laudanum in teaspoon doses, not to escape the world, but to keep enduring it. Some were praised for their composure, others were pitied. A few were institutionalized, diagnosed with chronic sleeplessness or hysteria when the tinctures stopped working. And yet they kept going. They built rituals, even around their remedies. A certain teaspoon, a whispered prayer, a velvet ribbon tied around the bottle as though dignity could still be preserved in the face of chemical surrender. You don't judge them, you understand them, because even now, in your own century, you've known that particular ache, the one that lingers in the bones long after midnight, the need for rest so profound it starts to resemble hunger. But laudanum won't help you tonight. You're not interested in numbing, you're interested in understanding what it meant back then to lie awake with no end in sight. You close your eyes again. The room is utterly still, and for the first time you feel something shift, not chemically, not physically, but quietly. You're not alone. Somewhere in this long lineage of sleepless souls, you've found company, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough to soften the edges. The hour is quiet now, deeper than midnight, but not yet morning. That timeless stretch where everything slows, even the ticking of the clock. Your body has grown still, your limbs soft, but your mind, it lingers, watching, waiting, not frantic, not frustrated, just awake. And in the Victorian world this too had meaning, because sleeplessness wasn't just seen as an affliction, it was sometimes interpreted as a test of character, of virtue, of faith. You shift slightly beneath the quilt, not because you're uncomfortable, but because you're beginning to realize that comfort was never the goal. Not entirely. Victorian culture had a way of spiritualizing suffering, especially the quiet kind. Insomnia, for many, became a kind of moral crucible. If you lay awake night after night, maybe it was because your soul was troubled, or not yet refined. Perhaps God was speaking to you, or testing you, or simply reminding you that rest was a reward, not a right. It sounds harsh. But then, so did most of the 19th century. You picture a dimly lit bedroom, a Bible resting on the nightstand. A woman kneels beside the bed, not in desperation, but in habit. She doesn't ask for sleep. She asks for patience, for strength, for understanding. Because insomnia, in the moral framework of her world, wasn't an obstacle. It was an opportunity to reflect, to repent, to surrender. Historians still debate how much of this framing was sincere and how much was cultural programming. Did people truly feel spiritually tested by their insomnia, or were they simply trying to make meaning from discomfort? Maybe both. You sigh, a soft sound, no judgment in it, just recognition. Because even today we sometimes do the same. We turn sleeplessness into a sign, a message, a reckoning. We search for reasons. What am I doing wrong? What am I being told? What am I avoiding? And so the Victorians prayed, not for sleep itself, but for the patience to endure the lack of it. They also wrote hymns, quiet, personal ones, meant to be sung in a whisper so as not to wake the household. Midnight Watch became a favorite, a gentle verse about angels keeping company with the sleepless. Some believed that being awake at 3 a.m. meant you were part of a sacred vigil, one known only to those chosen to bear it. That belief gave comfort, a sense of belonging. You weren't just awake, you were called. You lie still, feeling the edges of that idea wrap around you like a shawl. It's not unpleasant to be given purpose even in restlessness. There were, of course, limits. Not everyone saw insomnia as a gift. Some doctors dismissed it as over-sentimental nonsense. Others warned that excessive reflection could damage the mind. A few even declared that praying too often at night could stimulate the imagination unduly, which is possibly the most Victorian sentence ever written. But the culture persisted. Church sermons mentioned it. Novels hinted at it. Moral guides implied that sleeplessness might be a sign of emotional excess, or worse, intellectual pride. And so, like digestion, it became something to manage, not just medically, but ethically. You weren't supposed to chase sleep like a luxury. You were meant to earn it through obedience, through modesty, through restraint. And if it still didn't come, you bore it quietly, nobly, with grace, maybe even with a small smile in the morning when asked how you slept. A little restless, you'd say, with polite understatement, never confessing that your night had been long and dark and filled with half-forgotten regrets. You roll to your side now, not in frustration but in thought. What does it mean to be good at resting? The Victorians might say to be undemanding, quiet, unassuming, content with very little and grateful for even less. You wonder how many people pretended to sleep just to meet that ideal. You wonder how often you do the same. Outside, the wind shifts slightly. You can almost hear the rustle of trees beyond the glass. The world is still asleep, but you still are not. And maybe that's okay, because tonight you're not being punished. You're not being tested. You're simply awake in a long tradition of silent watchers, of thinkers, of slow breathers, of people who once believed that rest would come only when the soul was ready. You slip back into stillness. The book rests beside you now, forgotten but not abandoned, its pages slightly folded from your last thumbprint, a lingering mark of your quiet attempt to lull the brain into slowness. And it worked, almost. You drifted, not all the way, but far enough for a flicker of rest to settle over your limbs like warm breath. But sometimes even that flicker isn't enough. So you rise again, not in frustration, never in frustration now, but in surrender. The gentle, obedient kind the Victorians would have admired. You wrap yourself in something soft, wool perhaps, and open the door. The air is colder in the hallway. You move slowly, because it's time for a walk, a midnight walk, to be precise. A practice once as common as chamomile, and often more effective. In the gaslit cities of 19th century England, the streets never truly slept. Not entirely. Gentlemen in coats took slow, deliberate circuits around the squares. Women peeked from drawing-room windows, watching the world without entering it. And the insomniacs, of which there were many, wandered in search of nothing in particular, only silence. Historians still debate the purpose of these walks. Were they therapeutic, a form of moral correction, or simply a way to pass time in a world that refused to admit how many people couldn't sleep? You step outside into your own version of it. No fog, no lamplighter, but the mood lingers. Cool air on your face. A stillness not found inside. The occasional creak of wood or the distant cough of the city beyond. You are not alone, not really. Even then, in Victorian London, you would have passed others. Men pacing, perhaps rehearsing speeches, servants with buckets, milkmen preparing the first round, and the watchmen, those tireless guardians of the night, who struck their staves at each hour and called out the time with sleepy pride, 3 o'clock and all's well. You would have nodded. No words, just shared understanding, an unspoken club of those awake before the world. Not everyone approved. One 1851 pamphlet warned against the dangers of aimless nocturnal motion, citing moral decay and chilblains. It advised that true rest could only be found in bed, and in bed alone. But the heart often ignores such rules. It prefers movement, gentle, slow, thoughtful movement. And the Victorians understood that. Some doctors actually recommended walking as a treatment for overactive mental disposition. Others frowned but offered no better alternative. After all, pacing left no side effects, unlike laudanum or overmagnetization. You continue your circuit, slow and rhythmic, each step a kind of release. One foot in front of the other, not going anywhere, not needing to, because the goal isn't to tire yourself, it's to allow space for your thoughts to unfold, for your nerves to settle, for your inner clock to exhale. You imagine for a moment you're walking the perimeter of your own mind, checking its windows, tending its garden, patrolling the borders of consciousness, making sure no thought is too sharp, no regret too loud. This too is rest, even if your eyes are open. Back in your imagined Victorian lane, the fog would be lifting now. Horses stamping in stables, bakery chimneys beginning to smoke. And the insomniacs, your ancestors in sleeplessness, would return indoors, satisfied with their ritual. Sleep might still evade them, but they'd met the night on their own terms. You return now, slowly, your steps light, your body cooler, mind looser. Something in the air has shifted. Not fatigue exactly, but readiness. A settling. You lie back down. No rush, no commands, just gravity doing its work. There's no miracle cure waiting, no secret potion, no perfect routine. But there is rhythm. And you've found yours tonight in silence, in breath and in the soft echo of footsteps no one else hears. You don't need to force it anymore. You're already halfway there. You're back in bed now, the night air still clinging faintly to your skin, your breath steady. Not quite asleep, not quite awake. Somewhere in that thin place the Victorians knew well, a liminal layer between effort and surrender. Your eyes drift toward the book again. You smile barely, because even in the 1800s people knew that if all else failed, if footbaths, magnets, and midnight walks couldn't quiet the mind, then there was always one last tool in the insomniac's drawer. Books so boring they were practically medicinal. You open to a random page. The Victorian publishing world was flooded with well-meaning soporifics, not intentionally dull but dry by design, books about mineralogy, postal law, the life cycles of barnacles, and endless treatises on how best to prune fruit trees in northern climates. There was a charm in their predictability. One popular favorite was Lectures on the Proper Use of Milk in Urban Environments, a 300-page masterpiece that managed to be both deeply earnest and utterly unreadable, ideal for taming overactive thoughts. Historians still argue whether these texts were meant as genuine contributions to public knowledge or if they functioned quietly as sanctioned sleep aids. Either way, they worked. The trick wasn't to enjoy them. It was to surrender to their rhythm, the repetitive cadences, the meandering clauses, the gentle insistence that nothing particularly interesting would happen, ever, no matter how long you read. You blink slowly at the page in front of you. Some paragraph about the sanitary implications of improperly churned butter. Your brain tries to resist briefly. But resistance is futile. You are being gently smothered by commas and footnotes. This was a beloved trick of the Victorian middle class, especially among those too proud or too pious for laudanum. Reading until your mind gave up, until your thoughts blurred into the text and sleep snuck in sideways. You shift slightly, letting your fingers rest lightly on the paper. Of course, not all books were safe. Too much poetry, and you might become overstimulated. Too many adventure stories, and your heart would start to race. The wrong kind of story, full of longing or mystery, and you'd find yourself chasing someone else's thoughts instead of settling your own. So sleep seekers developed a kind of intuition. They knew which authors to avoid, which texts could be trusted, which chapters were guaranteed to soothe. There were lists passed between friends. Try chapter 9 of On the Cultivation of Turnips. Works every time. The right book was like a lullaby in ink. You turn another page slowly. The sentences here discuss milk distribution schedules in rural Shropshire. You don't care. No one does. That's the point. It occupies just enough of your mind to keep the louder thoughts at bay. The ones that whisper in the dark, that tug at the corners of sleep with questions and memories and unfinished tasks. But those thoughts have no space now. Not in the presence of this book. You can almost hear your Victorian counterpart, wrapped in a shawl, candle guttering on the nightstand, eyes growing heavy as a sentence about municipal water barrels trails off mid-thought. The book slips from her hands. Yours too nearly follows. You pause, not out of alertness, but from the sheer sweetness of this moment. The gentle weight of pages, the hum of quiet words, the slow, steady breath that follows even the dullest paragraph. It's not about boredom, really. It's about safety, the predictability of text, the neutrality of content, the absence of surprise. A world where nothing demands too much of you. That's the real sleep cure in the end. Not milk, not magnets, not pillows stuffed with iron filings. Just a place where your thoughts can rest without being interrupted. You close the book now, not because it's finished, but because you are. Not asleep yet, but ready. You lie back, feeling the quiet gather around you again like an old quilt. And for once your mind doesn't race. It ambles, slowly, sleepily, toward the next page, the next breath, the next gentle, uneventful dream. Somewhere in the thick velvet of the night, time begins to blur. You're not sure how long you've been lying there now, half listening to your breath, half floating on the slow waves of thought. But something new drifts in, almost unnoticed, a vague sense of guilt, because you're still awake, and somehow that feels like a failure. Where did that come from, you wonder? That voice in the back of your mind that says, you should be sleeping. Not just because your body needs rest, but because you're doing something wrong by staying awake. It's not just inconvenient, it's almost unproductive. And that, oddly enough, is a very modern idea, or so we'd like to believe. But the truth is, even the Victorians had sleep schedules. Not natural ones, manufactured ones, crafted carefully by the ticking gears of clocks, factories, and the growing sense that time, once wasted, could never be redeemed. You lie still, hearing echoes of that old pressure. Before the 19th century, sleep was guided by light. People slept when it was dark, woke when it was light, and filled the in-between with whatever made sense: prayer, dreams, mending, quiet thought. But then came gaslight, street lamps, shift work, the division of labor. Suddenly, the night was not your own. You belong to the schedule now. Historians still debate when exactly the 8-hour sleep became an ideal. But it took root during the rise of industrial capitalism, when time became a commodity and your body was expected to perform like a cog in a larger machine. 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. It sounded fair, noble even, but it left little room for drifting. You roll onto your side, and you feel it again, that low hum of tension. Not anxiety exactly, just the whisper that sleep should be efficient, that you should fall asleep quickly, stay asleep deeply, and wake up precisely when the system requires you to. Even at night, your hours are supposed to make sense. But the Victorians didn't all agree. There were quiet rebels among them, people who questioned this new mechanical rhythm, who wondered if humans were really meant to sleep in neat, measured blocks. They saw how the working class was being trained not just to work on command, but to rest on command too. No more segmented sleep, no more nighttime wandering, no more slow awakenings in the pale morning. Just sleep now, wake now, perform. And if you couldn't, well, that was your fault. Insomnia became a personal failing, not a mystery, not a pattern, just an inconvenience. Doctors began cataloging it, classifying it, selling it back to you in bottles and pamphlets and advice columns. You feel it now, don't you? That trace of internalized scheduling, the subtle self-scolding that says, "It's late. You should have fixed this by now." But what if there's nothing to fix? What if this moment, this quiet drifting between thoughts, this deepening stillness, isn't outside the sleep process, but part of it? What if the Victorian system, useful though it was for powering empires and railways and coal mines, was never meant to govern the human heart? You remember the milk, the magnets, the books that trailed off into sleep. None of them demanded efficiency. They invited it. They allowed for slowness, for softness, for failure. You imagine a night without a schedule. No pressure to optimize. No apps to track your REM cycles. No calendars dictating when you rise. Just the slow unfolding of rest as a natural event like fog or snowfall or dusk. You turn your face to the pillow. No alarm set, no countdown ticking, only breath and space, and a quiet awareness that the history of sleep is not about perfect nights, but about the ever-changing relationship between time and tenderness. And you right now are part of that history. You're not late, you're not behind, you're exactly where you are, and that is, perhaps, enough. The night is still deep, but its texture has changed. The air feels softer. Time has stopped asserting itself. You've lost count of the hours, and that, finally, feels like freedom. But you're not asleep yet, and part of you wonders, maybe that's the point. Because somewhere in the folds of Victorian thought, amid the teacups and tinctures, the moral instruction and milk, the sleepless began to shape something unexpected, an identity. To be restless wasn't always a curse. Sometimes it became a calling. Not everyone was ashamed of their wakefulness. Some wore it like a mark of intellect or of sensitivity, or simply of not quite fitting into the mold of a well-oiled, well-rested machine. The poets were the first. They wrote verses by candlelight, declaring sleep overrated and dreams inferior to the midnight mind. Lord Byron famously confessed to sleeping only 3 hours a night, and not always in his own bed, but that's a different topic. Charles Dickens, too, was an insomniac. He took long walks through London at night, letting the city speak to him in silence. Whole plots came to him in the mist. His characters wandered the same streets he did, troubled, thoughtful, wide-eyed. Historians still argue whether sleeplessness fueled Victorian genius or simply reflected the pressure such minds endured. But either way, wakefulness wasn't always hidden. Sometimes it was admired. To be an insomniac meant you were thoughtful, complex, perhaps a little haunted. And that reputation spread among bohemians, among melancholics, among anyone who secretly liked the stillness of 2 a.m. better than the chatter of 10 a.m. Suddenly, sleep became a bit basic, predictable, ordinary, whereas sleeplessness, when expressed through poetry or pale cheeks or deep sighs, hinted at something more profound, a bruised soul, a brilliant mind, a woman with too many thoughts to lay down easily. You smile faintly in the dark, because maybe, just maybe, you recognize that too. Maybe you've had nights where the silence felt sacred, where the world was finally quiet enough for you to hear your own thoughts without apology, where the shadows weren't frightening, just honest. There were Victorian women, usually upper class, who began to resist the shame of their insomnia. They wrote openly about it in their journals. They crafted identities around their wakefulness. "I do not sleep," one wrote. "I think, I observe, I endure." You shift slightly, the sheet cool beneath your hand. There's power in naming your sleeplessness, not as a failure, but as a space where you can reflect, wonder, exist without reacting, not needing to perform or please, just be. And yes, some people probably romanticized it too much. There were critics even then who said, "Enough with the sighing, just drink your warm milk and go to bed." But the fact remains, not everyone sought to be cured. Some simply sought to be understood. And isn't that what you're doing now? Not trying to erase your wakefulness, but to sit with it, to trace its shape, to understand how it links you to centuries of others who also lay awake and whispered to the dark. This isn't loneliness. This is inheritance. You are part of a long, sleepless lineage, and whether you drift off in 5 minutes or 50, you are not failing. You are participating, softly, quietly, with the same gentle pride that once lit candles in silent bedrooms, that once scribbled poems no one would read, that once stared into fireplaces and thought, there must be more to this than just rest. And there is. And now at last you feel it. Not a sudden drop into unconsciousness, not a switch flipping, but a slow, steady ebbing, like the tide gently pulling back from the shore. Your thoughts have grown loose. Your limbs are heavy but content. You're not chasing sleep anymore. You're letting it approach in its own time. And with that surrender comes something unexpected. Peace. Not the kind manufactured by routines or remedies or rigid discipline, but the kind that only arrives when nothing is demanded. When you allow the night to be what it is, a living, breathing part of your story. Not a blank space, but a full one. You've wandered through so many layers tonight. Milk warmed on the stove, iron filings tucked beneath your spine, books so dull they dissolved your very will to stay awake, velvet-wrapped bottles of laudanum, heavy quilts and heavier expectations, silent prayers muttered by gaslight, all of it wrapped around the simple human ache to rest, to quiet the mind, to slip into softness. And still you're here, not failed, not broken, not behind, just awake. And that's okay, because the Victorians were never really searching for sleep. They were searching for relief, for a pause, a moment when the noise faded and the self could simply float. They tried everything: science, superstition, routine, surrender, not because they were foolish, but because they were tender, tired, human. Historians still argue whether all their efforts amounted to much, but maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the answer isn't found in whether they slept better than we do, but in the ways they tried. In the quiet courage of people who refused to give up on rest, even when it eluded them for years. You breathe slowly now. The room is still. No more clocks. No more pressure. Just the gentle rhythm of now. And if you sleep soon, that's beautiful. And if you don't, well, you're in very good company. So now, let everything soften. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop a little more. Let your breath become something simple again, like the slow sway of curtains in an open window. The story is over, but the quiet it leaves behind, that's yours. The Victorians, for all their strange contraptions and chalky tinctures, were just like you, lying in the dark, wondering why their bodies wouldn't obey, listening to the creaks of old wood, hoping the quiet would carry them somewhere gentler. You don't need to do anything more tonight. Not think, not fix, not even sleep. Just rest. You've earned that. Let the weight of history hold you, not heavily, but like a familiar quilt. A reminder that your sleeplessness is not a flaw. It's a thread in a much older story, one shared by poets, mothers, doctors, rebels, and restless souls across centuries. Close your eyes or don't, drift or stay still. Whatever happens next, it's enough, because you're enough. Here in this quiet, here in this breath, here in this long, sleepy stretch between thoughts, where the world fades and nothing is expected of you anymore. So just stay, right here, floating, still, soft.